What's up, everyone? Morgano Smith here. Bodhi in the Brain, part 13. I believe it's 13. Should be 13 by now. Bodhi in the Brain, part 13. How you doing? This week we're going to talk about thresholds, emotional and mental thresholds. So this is something that's very important because this is something that most people miss, especially when I talk about the hardships of meditation, which I do quite often. I only do that only because they're true. At least for most people, not for everyone, but for most people, including myself. Meditation is very, the stuff that comes out of meditation can be very challenging, and people need to know that, especially if you're making a decision, if you want to start taking meditation on a higher level. I'm not talking about meditation for those who want to relieve stress and things of that sort. You hear that all the time, which we hear in the West of, a lot of stress is happening in my life, so I want to relieve stress. So I want to take up meditation, things of that sort. That's not what I'm really talking about, even though those things are included. But I'm talking about something much more profound, something that transcends all of that for those who are striving for that. And if you're striving for that, which I'm talking about, which leads to non-dual suchness and things of that sort, you realize that that challenge is that journey is very challenging. But along that, while you're on that journey, it comes with such mind-blowing benefits, things that I can't even put into words. So it's well worth it. But the reason why you're able to have these profound experiences and situations that happens in your life is because you've raised your level of threshold. So everyone has a threshold for different things. So people have a level of threshold when it comes to grossness, things that are gross. You can only handle a certain amount of that. Or some people have a threshold for how much, for, I don't know, scary movies, horror, things of that sort. Some people have a threshold, whether it's a low threshold, a mid threshold, or a high threshold for pain. And the list goes on with all the different things. You may have a low, medium, or high threshold for emotional distress, right? I have a very high threshold for emotional pain and distress. So I can take on a load of that and not be that affected by it. Or even if I'm affected by it, I can handle it for a long period of time. But that's something that I've learned to do through meditation. And the list goes on. Could be intellectual. People have, low, mid, high threshold for intellectual thought. And when I say intellectual thought, I'm speaking generally, but it could be broken up to, it could be academic, it could be mathematical, it could be scientific, it could be psychological, it could be philosophical. So you may have a high threshold in dealing with mathematics, but a low threshold for philosophy. So this goes on. So it doesn't mean that a person who, that if a person has a low threshold for intellectual thought, it doesn't mean all intellectual thought. It just may be a specific type. And then some people have a high threshold for all of them. They can handle mathematical information, scientific information, philosophical, psychological. It all depends. And it's also depending on our biases, our conditionings, cultural conditionings, and things of that sort, which determine where your threshold's at. And the list goes on. So it can happen with all the different throughout the emotional spectrum, and it can happen throughout the mental spectrum. The goal with meditation, though, one of the goals of meditation, because there are many, is it raises your threshold. It raises your threshold to handle whether it's intellectual thought, if it's handling the threshold of the day-to-day struggles of life. It could be emotional. One thing I should also mention that even when it comes to things that are pleasant, like happiness, some people have a low threshold for happiness, to be dead honest with you. And some people have a low threshold for love. Some have a low threshold for compassion. Some have a low threshold for empathy. And the list goes on. So even like there's different types of love. So one may have a low threshold for romantic love, but have a high threshold for platonic love. So it doesn't have to be the case where you have a low threshold for all forms of love. It can go up and down depending on where you're at throughout that spectrum. So, but as I was saying, when you meditate, you learn to raise your threshold, at least in certain areas. It doesn't mean it's going to raise your threshold in all the areas, but it would in certain areas. Though I will say, though, that in the moment of a spiritual awakening, you may have a high enough threshold to handle the whole spectrum of emotional feelings and the whole spectrum of mental capacity. So all of that can happen in the moment of a spiritual awakening, where you have a threshold high enough to handle all of that all at once, simultaneously, all the feelings and all emotions and all mental thinking, all in one event, throughout one event. So that can happen, and if you're having a spiritual awakening, that will happen. But of course, there's different. A spiritual awakening has its own spectrum. But when I'm referring to a spiritual awakening, I'm talking to the highest level, the non-dual suchness of Tita, which is covering the whole 100% spectrum of everything that could be felt. And you have to have a high enough threshold to deal with that, because if you don't have a high enough threshold and something like that occurs, it can be very psychologically crippling once you're out of that experience. So by having a high threshold, your brain and nervous system learns how to deal with that, or how to cope with the experience that you're going through. And then also, in many cases, you may not even attain those experiences if your threshold's too low. So the brain and the nervous system knows, it knows when it would be possible for you to actually have those experiences without harming the physical and the psychological bodies and things of that sort. So this is why, and I believe in most cases, most people don't have them because they don't have the threshold to handle that. And your brain and nervous system is there to also protect you. So you won't have those experiences until you learn how to raise your threshold. So again, Yinnergy, which is the meditation practice, the brainwave entrainment program that I created 12 years ago, it teaches you how to do that. It trains your brain and your nervous system to raise your threshold to handle for what's going on. Not only does it teach you how to handle what's going on in regards to your mental and emotional threshold, but it teaches you how to handle the stresses of life on a daily basis. So just like going through the pandemic and all the stuff that's happened, and how it affected people in a negative standpoint, for those of us who've been meditating for years, that never even occurred. So you see life differently. So even though you may be affected by the same things, you may see it differently from a different standpoint because you have a high enough threshold to do that. And that's why this is one of the reasons why meditation is so amazing, because it teaches you how to do that. It conditions you in such a way that no matter what life throws at you, you're able to handle them. Whether that's happening within your relationships, if it's happening with family, if it's happening within your career, at work, dealing with relationships with other people, in regards to business, work-related, whatever the case is, you learn to handle it because there's the balance between the two sides of the brain, and also too, the brain and nervous system has been presented with a frequency, with a stimuli of what it can't handle, and then over time it learns how to handle the stimuli that it's been affected by, which is Yinnergy, which is again based on binaural and monaural beats, and by exposing your brain and your nervous system to a stimuli that it can't handle, over time it learns how to handle it, and that can also be transferred to what's happening in your everyday daily life as your brain and nervous system is being exposed to everything that's happening around you. And of course, the amount of things that are happening around you, you can't even comprehend that, because it's a lot of stuff that your brain is learning to process as all these things are happening around you. So Yinnergy teaches you how to strengthen itself so it can handle the stimuli. And I'm proposing that the stimuli that's happening with Yinnergy, I would say it's a lot stronger than the stimuli that's happening around you. But that's I can say that for another segment. But this is why thresholds are important. And as I was saying earlier, you can have a low threshold for good things like love, compassion, and empathy, things of that sort. So because of our low thresholds in regards to those things, we would ignore people who are suffering. We act like they don't even exist unless it's happening within your own group or your own family, people you know, people who you've emotionally invested in. But when you raise your level of threshold, that changes. You start to care for more people, even people who are outside of your group. You may start to care for people who are disabled. You may start to care for people who are mentally disabled. You may start to care for people who are in a less fortunate situation than you are in regards to food, in regards to clothing, in regards to housing or shelter. And the list goes on, and you'll do what you can to help whoever you can, depending on the level of threshold that you have. And all the people that you see going out who work for Red Cross and all the, or volunteer for Red Cross and all these other services, they have a higher threshold for these issues. And that's the threshold of the heart. So Yinnergy teaches you not only the threshold of the brain, but also the threshold of the heart by pushing the brain, the nervous system, the heart to take on more, especially when it's necessary. And this is why these things are important. So when you have tools like Yinnergy, and there's other tools out there, they train you to become a better human being. And all that. And the list goes on of all the things you can do. So not only are you trying to learn how to raise your threshold for negative things, you're learning how to stretch and increase your thresholds for positive things, because they both go hand in hand. And this is really, really important, especially when it comes to those who want to practice a form of meditation to reach their highest potential as a human being. But not only as a human being, of course, as I said, if you have a spiritual awakening, you get to see your potential of who you actually are, or what you actually are. You become the who, when, where, why, and how. So the who, what, when, where, why, how. You become all those things, or you realize that you're all those things. And you have to have a very, 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 very high threshold to handle the realization of what you actually are. And what you actually are is infinity. That's it for this week, everyone. Talk to you next week. Take care.